Taylor?
Hey, thank you so much, Scott. We are so thrilled to be joined here first on CNBC by the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, following a marathon hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday. Secretary, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start to talk about expectations for this infrastructure package. President Biden will be laying out the what of the package next week, but how many jobs will it create and at what net cost to the American people?
Well, I think there's certainly no net cost. There will be a net gain. When you think about infrastructure, it's a classic example of the kind of investment that has a return on that investment. That's one of many reasons why we think this is so important. This is a jobs vision as much as it is an infrastructure vision, a climate vision, and more. Obviously, the numbers are still being reviewed. The president's deciding what will go into what's going to be rolled out next week. But what I'll say is that expectations have been high. They've been high before. We're probably the third administration in a row to arrive with the American people expecting big things on infrastructure. I think this time we can actually get it done.
So you said yesterday it will be at least partially paid for. Senate Democrats are expecting around $3.5 trillion. What part of that will be paid for?
Well, that's obviously part of what we need to work with Congress to establish. I'm hearing a lot of appetite to make sure that there are sustainable funding streams. And again, at the same time, we know there's a great return on investment on infrastructure, so some level of deficit financing could make sense. We got to make sure that what we come up with is responsible, that it is reliable, and that it's going to work for America, not just for this moment, but for a generation.
We are expecting business taxes and high-income individual taxes to go up as part of this package, but there's some other revenue raisers under discussion that are squarely in your wheelhouse. And I want to go sort of rapid fire through them because you've commented on some of them before. First, a gas tax. You've called it old-fashioned to raise the gas tax. Do you still believe that? Could that go up?
Well, the gas tax has traditionally been part of how we fund the Highway Trust Fund, but we know that it can't be the answer forever because we're going to be using less and less gas. We're trying to electrify the vehicle fleet. So if there's a way to do it that doesn't increase the burden on the middle class, we can look at it. But if we do, we got to recognize that's still not going to be the long-term answer.
What about a mileage-based tax?
So I think that shows a lot of promise. If we believe in that so-called user pays principle, the idea that part of how we pay for roads is you pay based on how much you drive, the gas tax used to be the obvious way to do it. It's not anymore. So a so-called vehicle miles traveled tax or mileage tax, whatever you want to call it, could be a way to do it.
Build America bonds?
Definitely a lot of promise in terms of the way that we leverage that kind of financing. And, you know, there have been ideas around things like a national infrastructure bank, too. I don't mean to try to disrupt the spirit of the rapid fire, but you're hearing a lot of maybe here because all of these things need to be balanced and could be part of the mix.
And then a tax on carbon emissions. The Tax Foundation has suggested that at the rate that the Biden administration has set for the per ton cost of carbon, that it could raise about $2 trillion. Will you move in that direction?
So carbon pricing is one of the ways that a lot of economists and the business community believe we can have a market-driven approach that also deals with greenhouse gases. But it's too soon to assign a use for those dollars, even if it does happen, because you could do it in many different ways. There's even a version of it that would be revenue neutral. The point of carbon pricing is that there's less carbon. I wouldn't think of it just as a revenue mechanism.
Would you see that happening in the next year?
Again, that requires Congress, that requires the president and Congress to be in alignment. And these are exactly the conversations we're having right now with Democrats and Republicans on the Hill and within the administration.
You've said that you talk to Republicans almost every day.
Yeah.
Just this week, they've called this package a boondoggle and a ploy, the way that it's been reported the administration is structuring it. Meanwhile, progressives have suggested it's not big enough. It needs to be $10 trillion. So how do you thread that needle?
Well, given that the package hasn't even been rolled out yet, it feels a bit like politics. At the end of the day, there's going to have to be a single answer that everybody will want to tug in one direction or another. But what we know is we've got to think big. We've got to have an investment that's going to support the next generation. It's got to be transformative. And I think that Republicans and Democrats alike see the need for that.
One Republican in particular, John Thune from South Dakota, said if the ploy is to lure Republicans to vote for the easy stuff and then do all the controversial stuff through reconciliation, I don't think our guys take the bait. How do you respond to that?
To me, this isn't bait. This is desperately needed American infrastructure improvements. And I'm a little puzzled by that comment because, to me, we want to make sure that there is the strongest case made for any senator to vote for any provision of what we're doing. Now, as we saw with the rescue package, sometimes we can convince Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, and that still doesn't mean we can convince everybody on Capitol Hill. But if there's one area where we can do it, I believe infrastructure is that area.
On reopening the economy, the travel industry has asked by May 1st that the administration give it a plan to restore international travel. Can you deliver on that?
We take our lead from the Centers for Disease Control, and the CDC is looking at conditions on the ground. We've got a race going on right now. It's a race between the vaccines and the variants. The more we win that race, the sooner we can have a safe return for travel. And look, I'm the Secretary of Transportation. I'm probably the most impatient person to get that safe return to travel underway, but it's got to be safe. And we're not going to get ahead of what the science is telling us, what the doctors are telling us, what medicine is telling us about what is the right thing to do to keep the American traveling public and workers safe.
The president has enacted some policies to try to make the government's own operations more green, notably trying to make the fleet of vehicles, electric vehicles, 650,000 of them. Where does that effort stand?
Yeah, this is a really important thing. First of all, because the federal government ought to lead by example. The policy of this administration is to go green, so our vehicles ought to reflect that. Secondly, just think about the purchasing power of the federal government, just with the cars that we buy. So I know that entails a lot of different bodies, right? You got the Postal Service, which is a quasi-governmental entity. You got the Department of Defense, even here in the DOT. Of course, we don't own most of the transportation assets in the country, but we got a lot of cars and other vehicles that we use. We got to make sure we're leading the way too. So the president has challenged us with an executive order to be moving in the direction of more climate-friendly operations. We're running with that, and we're going to make sure that we're setting very aggressive targets and hitting them.
Finally, when you think about just the size of government, agencies, programs, conservative economists have drawn parallels to LBJ's Great Society and suggested that massive government spending paired with, wartime programs would lead to out-of-control inflation. You're a student of history. Why do you believe that is or is not the case?
I believe it's not the case because it's been shown not to be the case in our time. For the last 40 years, the U.S. has pursued a policy of intentional disinvestment. And as a consequence, we've fallen behind the rest of the developed world. We need to decide whether we are content to permanently remain behind the rest of the developed world or whether we're ready to take the lead again. The very era that those economists are referring to are a time when U.S. leadership was unquestioned. Sadly, that's not the case today. You look at the investments China alone is making in, for example, their infrastructure. It is a multiple of what we here at home are doing, and that's going to have consequences for our competitiveness in the long term.
Secretary, hopefully we can continue this conversation as we get more details about the package. We appreciate you joining us on an extremely windy morning here in Washington. Secretary Pete Buttigieg, our thanks to you.
Thanks.
Scott, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, wind, Kayla, that I think